The day my father refinanced our family home for my brother's startup. He told me something I will never forget. He looked me straight in the eyes and said, "Ethan is the future of this family. Not part of the future, not one of our hopes. The future." And the worst part? He said that while standing in a kitchen filled with ideas my brother had never built, models he never understood, and a reputation he had spent his whole life borrowing from me, I could have exposed him that day. I could have told my parents the truth. I could have told the investors. I could have burned the whole lie down before they put the house behind it. But I didn't. I let them believe my brother was a genius. I let them keep worshiping him. I let them build their future on a fraud. Because after years of watching my family erase me to make him look extraordinary, I decided something. If they wanted the myth that badly, then they could pay the full price for it. And when it finally collapsed, it didn't just destroy my brother, it ruined everything. The first time my parents called my brother a genius, I was 10 years old. And I remember that morning with the kind of clarity people usually reserve for funerals and car crashes. The sunlight coming through the kitchen window, the smell of coffee. My mother with flour on her hands from rolling dough. My father standing by the counter in a pressed shirt, flipping through the business section like the future could be understood in neat columns of black ink. And Ethan, standing in the middle of the kitchen holding a bridge made of popsicle sticks. My bridge. That mattered. Not emotionally, factually. I had built it the night before, measured the support spacing, redrawn the base twice, tested the load with hardback books from the hallway shelf, stayed up too late making sure the stupid thing would survive the classroom demonstration. It had taken me hours. Ethan had seen it drying on newspaper at breakfast. That was all. He saw it. Then Mom walked in. Then Dad. Then the story began. "Did you build that?" my mother asked him. Ethan did what he would later become very, very good at. He paused. Not long, just long enough. Long enough to let the room decide for him. Then he gave a small shrug. A little. That was all it took. My father laughed softly in disbelief. "Look at that," he said. "That boy's mind is unbelievable." My mother smiled in the way only mothers of golden children do, a smile that was already halfway to prophecy. I always knew there was something special about the way he thinks. I stood 3 feet away, glue still drying under my fingernails, and said nothing. People always ask me why. Why didn't I correct them? Why didn't I say, "No, I built it"? Because even at 10 years old, I already understood something ugly about my family. They didn't want accuracy. They wanted a version of us that made them feel lucky. A gifted son, a remarkable future, a child they could point at and say, "Look what we made." And if I had interrupted that scene with the truth, I would not have become the hero. I would have become the problem, the difficult child, the petty sister, the one ruining a beautiful moment over something they would immediately call sharing. So I stayed quiet, and that silence lasted years longer than it should have, because that morning did not just give Ethan credit for a school project, it gave my family a mythology, and once people fall in love with a flattering myth, they will defend it harder than they ever defended the truth. My mother had a favorite word for me growing up. Not smart, not gifted, not brilliant, steady. Whenever relatives came over and praised Ethan for being so advanced for his age, my mother would smile and say, "And Ava is our steady one." Steady. It sounded kind, almost affectionate. It took me years to understand what it actually meant. Steady meant useful. Steady meant low maintenance. Steady meant no one had to rearrange the family story for me. Steady children are very convenient. They absorb chaos. They do the hard work. They do not demand applause for surviving, and that became my role before I was old enough to resist it. Ethan was the one people watched. I was the one who made sure things worked. If he had an idea, I strengthened it. If he had an assignment, I organized it. If he had a presentation, I cleaned the language, tightened the structure, patched the weak points he didn't even know were there. At first, it happened in tiny ways. A homework problem here, a speech opening there, a science fair display layout, a better title for a project, a cleaner conclusion, always small enough to dismiss, always ordinary enough to call sibling help. But repetition turns small things into systems, and by middle school, a system already existed. Ethan performed. I repaired. He dazzled. I stabilized. He got praised for promise. I got used for competence. My parents did not see this as unfair. That would have required them to actually look. Instead, they saw exactly what they wanted to see: a brilliant son, a dependable daughter, a perfect arrangement. That was Ethan's real talent. Not intelligence, not technical vision, not discipline, narrative instinct. He understood something most adults still never learn. If you let other people complete the lie for you, you rarely have to say anything directly false. He almost never said, "I built that," when he knew I had done most of the work. He did something smarter. He let praise arrive. Then he stood inside it. He let people assume. He let teachers smile. He let our parents brag. And when silence itself begins delivering results, it becomes addictive. By the time he was 14, Ethan already knew how to use humility as camouflage. He knew how to look modest while accepting credit, how to laugh off praise without rejecting it, how to say things like, "It was nothing," or "I just got lucky," or my favorite, "I had some help." Some help. That phrase did incredible work in our house, because some help can cover anything from a quick proofreading pass to years of invisible intellectual labor. And my family loved vague language. Vague language kept the center intact. It allowed everyone to keep admiring Ethan while still believing I mattered in some comforting, harmless, background way. I mattered the way scaffolding matters to people admiring a building. Useful, necessary maybe, but never the thing anyone actually came to see. I was 13. Ethan was 15. He came into my room carrying a geometry workbook and that familiar expression he always wore when he needed something but still wanted to feel above asking for it too directly. "You're better at proofs than I am," he said. I kept writing. "So? Can you check these?" I took the workbook. He had barely done the first half of the work. The logic was incomplete, the middle steps missing, the conclusions floating unsupported. Even then, that was Ethan's pattern. He liked endings more than structure. He liked sounding finished more than actually building the bridge to get there. "You didn't do these," I said. He smiled. "That's why I brought them to you." I looked up. "Why don't you finish them yourself?" The surprise on his face told me everything, not anger at first. Surprise, because in his mind, my function was not negotiable. It was like asking a lamp why it suddenly objected to being switched on. Then my mother called from downstairs. "Ava?" "Yes?" "Can you help your brother? He's getting frustrated." There it was. The family stepping in to enforce the arrangement before I had even fully resisted it. I should have held the line. I didn't. I took the workbook. An hour later, the proofs were complete. The next week, Ethan's teacher praised the elegance of his reasoning. My father repeated that phrase to a neighbor at a barbecue, and I stood there with a paper cup in my hand, listening to my brother get admired for logic that had passed through my brain before it ever touched his page. That was the thing no one understands about long-term erasure. The injury is rarely loud. It accumulates. A phrase here, a project there. 100 little moments where you watch the room reward someone else for what you quietly fixed. And because each moment is small on its own, you feel ridiculous naming it. Until one day, the pattern is your whole life. The first time Ethan said something that truly frightened me, we were teenagers. He was preparing for a statewide student competition with a proposal for a low-cost emergency water filtration model. The idea sounded impressive, compassionate, innovative. Exactly the kind of thing adults love attaching themselves to when they want to feel they've discovered brilliance early. The problem was that his model was weak. The assumptions didn't hold. The cost estimates were soft. The maintenance burden was almost non-existent on paper, which is usually how you know someone is selling aspiration rather than structure. He brought the deck to my room 2 nights before the competition finals. "Tell me what's wrong with it," he said. "Not can you help. Not can you look. Tell me what's wrong with it." I went through it, slide by slide. By the end, I knew exactly how judges would tear it apart. "The cost model doesn't survive actual replacement intervals," I said. He crossed his arms. So? So it's wrong?" He frowned. "You always do this." "Do what?" "Act like if something isn't perfect, it's worthless." That sentence stayed with me for years, because it told me how Ethan understood me. I wasn't the person making his work stronger. I was the inconvenient voice standing between him and applause. The rest of the world saw a bright, charismatic future star. I saw the structural cracks. And in his mind, that made me negative, difficult, small-minded. I should have let him fail right there. Instead, I spent 3 hours rebuilding the proposal, not because I believed in him, because I still believed proximity gave me some control over the damage. He won. Of course he did. My parents cried. My father shook hands like he had personally launched something historic. My mother said, "We always knew he was special." And I stood behind them holding Ethan's jacket and water bottle like staff at my own erasure. That night, something in me hardened. Not enough to stop. Not yet. But enough to begin understanding the real danger. Ethan did not merely like praise. He believed he deserved the architecture beneath it. By the time we got to senior year, my family's belief in Ethan had become more than emotional. It had become financial, strategic, social. My father began speaking about Ethan's future like a long-term investment. Not if, when, not maybe, inevitable. My mother framed his college acceptance letter. Actually framed it. Hung it in the hallway like a sacred artifact. Guests saw it before they saw half our family photos. She'd stand beneath it and say, "Ethan's future started there." No one ever asked where mine started. That part never bothered them. I got into a very strong program too, on scholarship, mathematics and systems design, the kind of field where being right matters more than sounding brilliant. My father congratulated me over breakfast without looking up from the newspaper. "That's great, Ava," he said. "Very practical." Practical. That was my whole role to them. Ethan inspired language. I inspired utility. Still, distance should have changed things. It didn't. The requests just moved into emails, calls, and holiday breaks. A quick look at a draft. A simple question about a model. A tiny favor before some major submission. One Christmas break, Ethan came into my room with a stack of notes for his capstone proposal. He looked nervous. Actually nervous. "This matters," he said. "So? So help me." I looked at the pages. Messy concept, weak sequence, overdressed language, underbuilt logic, the old pattern in older clothes. And for the first time, I told him something close to the truth. "You're only impressive because I keep sanding the rough edges off your work." He stared at me. Not guilty. Annoyed. Like I had broken some rule by saying aloud what both of us knew. "That's not true," he said. "It is. You help me sometimes." I laughed. "Sometimes?" That made him angry. "You're being dramatic." There it was again. Take a woman's precision. Call it emotion. Take a pattern. Call it exaggeration. Take repeated theft. Call it support. I should have thrown him out of my room. Instead, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I helped one more time. Only this time, the stakes were larger. The proposal became a capstone. The capstone became a grant application. The grant application became the technical credibility that later built his startup mythology. And the core framework inside it? That was mine. Not every word, not every slide, not the polish, not the pitch. The skeleton. The thing that mattered. The thing that made people in serious rooms lean forward instead of tuning out. That was mine. And when he won the grant, my father sent me the announcement with the subject line, "This is what greatness looks like." I archived the email because some humiliations deserve to be saved. After the grant, Ethan stopped being promising. He became inevitable. That was the new word in our house. My father said it over dinner. My mother said it to friends. Relatives repeated it like family scripture. Ethan had momentum now, visibility, institutional validation, and once the world starts confirming a family myth, the family's attachment to it becomes almost unbreakable. The startup was the obvious next step. Of course he launched one. Of course investors liked the story. Young founder, systems thinker, visionary logistics intelligence, adaptive infrastructure platform. All the right words, all the right posture, all the right energy, until you touch the actual technical core. That was where he always became dangerous. Because Ethan did not fully understand the machinery he was using to attract a belief. He understood the outer language of it, the shape, the atmosphere, the emotional impact, not the load-bearing internal sequence. When he showed me the first investor deck, I knew immediately it was weak. The numbers were dressed. The assumptions were optimistic to the point of fiction. The model architecture was still dependent on thinking he could present, but not defend. And then my father invested. Not just savings, real money, painful money. The kind of money careful people do not put behind vision alone unless they have confused admiration with due diligence. "How much?" I asked. My father named the number. It made my stomach turn. I should have told them everything that night. I should have said, "This company is a stage built on vocabulary he did not create and a framework he cannot sustain under pressure." Instead, I looked at the deck and said, "It's ambitious." That was the last lie I ever told for him. Because in families desperate for reassurance, ambiguity becomes blessing almost instantly. My father smiled. My mother relaxed. Ethan mistook my silence for support. A month later, he called and asked for help building the system architecture behind the investor demo. And for the first time in my life, I said no. Not loudly, not dramatically, just no. He laughed first, then realized I meant it, then panicked, then got angry, then tried guilt, then tried family, but the answer stayed the same. No. And that is when the real collapse began. Because for the first time in his life, Ethan had to stand on work that was actually his. And I knew something no one else did. It would never hold. The investor demo should have been a celebration. That's what my family thought. That's what Ethan thought. A polished walkthrough. A few intelligent nods. A room impressed by scale and possibility. A pathway to more money. Instead, one consultant asked a specific question, a real one. Not broad enough for Ethan to surf. Not flattering enough for him to redirect. A question about the rooting logic under volatility pressure. He answered with language. They asked again. He answered with bigger language. Then someone asked who built the original architecture. That was the moment he froze. And when a man like Ethan freezes in front of serious money, the room changes instantly. They asked for the original technical materials. He called me in panic. I refused. Then I learned the real stakes. My father had refinanced the house. For the company. For Ethan. For the future of the family. That was when I understood the full size of the lie. It wasn't just emotional anymore. It wasn't just family hierarchy. It wasn't just stolen credit. It was debt. Property. Exposure. A house built around a son they had mistaken for destiny. And I still didn't save them. That matters. Because from that point on, I knew exactly what my silence would cost. I chose truth anyway. Not out of impulse. Out of exhaustion. Because if I saved them one more time, there would never be a final time. There would only be a larger lie next year. A more expensive crisis. A bigger room. A heavier mortgage. A worse ending. So when Investor Counsel asked whether I had documentation of my role, I said yes. And the moment I said yes, the story stopped being family drama. It became evidence. The formal review happened without my parents. That alone changed everything. For once, Ethan had to stand in a room where family mythology had no vote. Counsel, investors, an outside technical advisor, Ethan, me, that was it. They asked him a mechanics question, a simple, lethal one. He answered with atmosphere. The advisor said, "That is not an answer." Then she turned to me. I answered cleanly. Then again. Then again. The room heard the split. Not the emotional one, the structural one. The difference between the person who built the logic and the person who had been wearing it. I placed the drive on the table, showed them the timestamps, the draft chains, the comment trails, the forwarded emails, the grant committee questions sent to me, my technical responses used in his submission, the warning I had written years before. If they ask this live, don't improvise. You won't survive follow-up questions. Then they asked Ethan why he had not credited me. And for the first time in his life, he told the truth. Because if people knew I was behind the technical side, they would have looked at him differently. That was the entire story. Not innovation, not bad luck, not misunderstanding. Visibility management. He understood that as long as I stayed unseen, he looked inevitable. And he built his life on that fact. That was the moment the myth died. Not when I spoke. When he admitted why he needed me hidden. Collapse is rarely loud at first. No headlines, no immediate explosion, just withdrawal. Paused calls, frozen interest. People quietly deciding not to attach themselves to a name that now entered rooms under a different temperature. The startup began dying in administrative silence. My father tried to contain it. My mother tried to soften it. Ethan tried one final public post about family contribution and misunderstood collaboration. It backfired. Too many people had already heard the mismatch. Too many professionals had already seen the structural split. The story no longer worked. The house was sold 6 months later, not in ruin, in contraction. Which can feel worse? A smaller place across town? No framed acceptance letter in the hallway. No more polished dinners about Ethan's future. No more language of inevitability. My father changed first in silence. My mother changed first in grief. Ethan disappeared for a while, then took an ordinary operations job in another state. Not founder, not visionary. Just a man inside a system who would have to survive actual supervision and actual questions. For the first time in his life, ordinary was the only honest thing left for him. Almost a year later, Ethan asked to see me. We met at a quiet place near the river. He looked older, not broken, stripped, as if someone had finally removed all the expensive language from around him and left only the man beneath it. He asked me one question. When did you decide to stop saving me? I thought about the bridge, the proofs, the speeches, the proposal, the grant, the startup. Then I told him the truth. When you stopped even pretending to be grateful. That hurt him. I could see it. Because that was the deepest part of it. Not the theft alone, the entitlement. He had stopped thinking he was taking from me. He thought those pieces belonged to him once they became useful enough. Then he said something almost tragic. I thought we were a team. I stared at him. No, I said. You thought I was invisible. That was the closest we ever came to closure. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, accuracy, which, in my experience, is rarer and far more valuable. People always expect revenge to feel triumphant, clean, satisfying. But that's not how stories like this end. They end with smaller things. A house sold under pressure. A mother who stops telling pretty lies because they cost too much now. A father who finally understands that admiration is not due diligence. A brother forced to discover who he is without stolen light beneath him. And me, living in a home paid for by work that carries my own name. Finally understanding the one thing I should have learned much sooner. The opposite of being erased is not revenge. It's authorship. It's saying, this was mine. You do not get to keep it just because I was silent too long. That was what ruined everything. Not jealousy, not cruelty, not bitterness. Accuracy. Because once I stopped helping them confuse my labor for his genius, the entire story collapsed on its own. I didn't destroy my brother's future. I just stopped carrying it for him. The first sign that the investor demo had gone catastrophically wrong was not Ethan's call. It was the fact that my mother called before he did. That mattered. Because my mother only moved first when the emotional narrative had already started forming. If Ethan called first, there was still a chance he believed he could control the story. If my mother called first, it meant the story had already slipped. It meant the room had gone cold, Ethan had panicked, and my mother was now rushing to drape family language over something that was quickly becoming too structural to soften. I was in my apartment kitchen when her name lit up across the screen. The lights were off, except for the lamp over the stove. The city outside my windows looked wet and silver, even though it hadn't rained. I remember that clearly because I had just set down my keys and was still holding my bag strap when the phone started vibrating. Mom? Her voice came fast, too fast. Ava, please answer your brother when he calls. No hello, no disguise, just the emergency. I set the bag down slowly. What happened? There was a small pause, the kind people make when they are trying to choose between truth and strategy and have not yet decided which one will protect them better. Things didn't go well. That sentence almost made me laugh. Things didn't go well. A phrase so soft it could have described a burned casserole. Not a founder failing to answer questions about the system he was using to sell investors on his brilliance. What happened? I asked again. They were unfair. Of course. There it was, the first family translation. Not, they asked him what he built. Not, he couldn't explain the architecture. Not, the people in the room heard the split between the language and the understanding underneath it. No, they were unfair. I leaned back against the counter. How? They pushed him too hard. My mother's voice shook. Real fear was beginning to leak through the performance now. Pushed him how? With details, she said, almost angrily, like detail itself were rude. Technical things, questions about the system. I closed my eyes for a second, because there it was, the whole disaster in one sentence. A room had finally asked Ethan to stand where I had been standing for years, inside the mechanics, and he could not. Mom, I said quietly, that was the demo. She inhaled sharply. That's not the point. It was exactly the point. But in my family, the point was never what happened. The point was always how quickly the emotional center could be restored. They embarrassed him, she whispered. No, I thought. They exposed him. Those are different things. Embarrassment is social. Exposure is structural. Embarrassment hurts feelings. Exposure rearranges reality. Before I could answer, the call ended. Not because she hung up, because Ethan was calling through. I stared at the screen for 1 second, then answered. He didn't say hello. I need to see you. Not can I come over? Not are you home? Just, I need to see you. I walked toward the window. The glass was cool beneath my fingers. No. Silence. Then sharper. What? No. Ava, don't do this. That phrase. It came so automatically from him, as if my boundary itself were the aggression, as if years of invisible labor had simply become the natural weather of his life, and any change in climate now counted as violence. What happened? I asked. His breathing was fast, controlled, but only barely. The way men like Ethan sound when they are trying to keep panic from thinning their voice. One of the consultants started asking about the adaptive routing logic. I said nothing. He continued. Then one investor asked why the output priorities shifted under volatility and whether the correction thresholds were dynamic or rule-anchored. His voice changed when he said the last part. Not because he understood the question better, because repeating it out loud made him hear the problem again. That question was precise, not impossible. Not overly technical for someone claiming to have built the framework, just precise enough to kill a fraud. What did you say? I asked. There was a pause. Then he gave me the answer in the same tone a man might use to describe a car crash he could see coming 3 seconds before impact. I said the system was built to preserve predictive stability across changing disruption conditions. I shut my eyes. That means nothing. I know that now. That answer almost startled me, not because it was self-aware, because panic had pushed him close enough to the truth to recognize emptiness after the fact. What happened next? One of them asked me to define the weighting logic. And? He laughed once, a dry, angry sound. And I tried. That word held more humiliation than anything else he'd said. Tried. Because Ethan had spent most of his life in rooms where trying confidently was often enough. Schoolrooms, family rooms, networking rooms, rooms full of adults who liked potential, performance, charisma, shine. But this room had money in it, and money does not forgive vagueness once it has started listening carefully. I waited. Then he said the sentence that told me the room had shifted from impressed to suspicious. They asked for the original development files. There it was. The real danger. Not failure. Tracing. When people ask for original files, they are no longer wondering whether the founder had a bad night. They are wondering whether the origin story is false. And false origin stories are poison, because they change the interpretation of everything that came after them. Why? I asked. You know why. Yes, I did. Because someone in that room heard the split. The person who wrote the bones of the thing and the person currently wearing its skin did not sound like the same mind. And now the room wanted to know where the bones came from. Then he said it. The sentence I had known was coming from the moment my mother called first. I need the old files. I let the silence sit between us. He mistook it for hesitation and pushed harder. The original framework drafts, the technical notes, the architecture versions, all of it. My files, I said. That's not fair. There it was again. The same instinctive recoil every time truth arrived in language too exact to survive comfortably. Not fair. As if ownership itself were some cruel distortion I had invented after years of politely disappearing for him. What exactly do you plan to do with them? I asked. His answer came too quickly. Show continuity. I almost smiled. Continuity. Such a clean word for theft. Show continuity meant, take the trail of my mind and use it one more time to keep strangers believing the false story long enough for the structure to survive. No, not again. Call me when you're ready to tell the truth, I said. Then I hung up. My father called less than 10 minutes later. He did not ask how I was. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what Ethan had told me. He not ask what Ethan had told me. He did not ask what I thought happened in the room. He asked one question. How much do you still have? That was when I knew the situation was worse than even Ethan had admitted, because my father only skipped emotional choreography when fear had already become numerical. How much of what? I asked. The materials. Inventory. Always inventory with him. The records, the architecture, the trail. Not truth. Assets. He was already thinking like a man trying to estimate exposure. Enough, I said. He exhaled. Then bring everything to the house tonight. Not ask. Command. He was scared enough now to stop pretending this was still negotiable. I almost said no. Instead, I said, How much did you put into this company? Silence. Then, that is not the issue. It was the issue. It had always been the issue. Because the moment my father's money entered Ethan's mythology, the lie stopped being a private wound and became a structural hazard. How much? His tone turned colder. Tonight, 8 o'clock. Then he hung up. I almost didn't go. But there is a point in every family collapse where you realize you are not attending conversations anymore. You are attending reveals. So I drove across town under a sky the color of bruised metal and parked outside the house I had grown up in. It looked exactly as it always had. The porch swept, the brass numbers polished, the hedges trimmed. My mother still believed, even now, that if the outside remained respectable long enough, the inside might remember how to behave. When I stepped through the front door, the smell of lemon oil and roasted garlic hit me instantly. Dinner had been prepared. Of course it had. My mother always staged crisis against a civilized backdrop if she could. It was one of her deepest instincts. Make the table beautiful enough, and maybe the truth will soften itself out of politeness. The dining room looked like Thanksgiving. Good plates, candles, napkins folded too neatly. Ethan was already there, sitting rigidly near the window. My father stood by the sideboard with a glass in his hand. My mother was in the kitchen doorway, drying her hands on a towel she didn't need. No one smiled. Sit, my father said. I sat. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence felt rehearsed, as though they had already had most of the real conversation before I arrived, and now needed me only for the piece that required my participation. Then my father said, You need to tell us exactly what you have. There it was again. No curiosity, no concern, no version of events. Just the archive. The records of the hidden life they had spent years benefiting from without ever naming properly. I looked at Ethan. He looked away first. That mattered. He never looked away first when he thought he still controlled the room. I have enough, I said. My mother stepped in quickly. Ava, this doesn't have to become something awful. Awful. Their favorite category. Truth becomes awful only after it threatens something expensive. Not when a child gets erased. Not when one sibling's labor becomes another sibling's halo. Only when the house starts shaking. What exactly happened tonight? I asked. My father answered before Ethan could. The room became adversarial. That word told me who he had already decided to blame. Not Ethan. The room. The people asking questions had become the aggressors. Not the founder who could not explain his own framework. Adversarial. I looked at Ethan. Did they ask questions you should have been able to answer? He stared at the table. My father cut in. That's not helpful. No, I said. It's exact. That changed the temperature immediately. My father's jaw hardened. My mother flinched. Ethan looked up at me with that familiar mix of anger and injury he always wore when someone forced him too close to actual scale. This is not the time, he said. It's exactly the time. My father set down his glass. Your brother's future is hanging by a thread. There it was. The emotional framing. Future. Not facts. Not credibility. Not authorship. Future. A hanging thing, apparently now placed in my hands yet again. How much? I asked him quietly. This time he did answer. Not with a number, with a sentence. More than you understand. That was enough. No one says that unless the amount has already crossed the line between optimism and damage. My mother sat down slowly like her knees had gone weak. Ethan said nothing. And in that silence, I finally understood something I had sensed for months, but refused to fully name. My father had not simply invested savings. He had gone further. A lot further. My voice came out almost calm. What did you do? No one answered. So I asked again. What did you do? My father looked at the table. My mother started crying. Quietly at first, then harder. And I knew before anyone spoke. The house. Of course it was the house. My father had refinanced the house. For Ethan, for the company, for the future of the family, for the myth. The whole room looked different after that. Not physically, emotionally. Like the walls had suddenly become a little thinner. The table smaller. The polished silver ridiculous. Because now the lie had a mortgage under it. You refinanced the house, I said. My father's face flushed. It was Bridge Capital. That phrase nearly made me laugh. Bridge Capital. A beautiful, tidy, financially literate phrase for something so nakedly emotional it almost hurt to look at. No, I said. It was faith. He stood up. It was strategy. You don't put a house behind strategy when the founder can't explain his own architecture. That hit harder than I meant it to. My mother cried louder. Ethan finally spoke. Dad believed in me. I turned to him. And you let him. For the first time that night, Ethan looked almost ashamed. Only for a second. Then the shame retreated behind the old shield. Defensiveness, family language. The assumption that my role, whatever else was happening, remained to help absorb the consequences. That's what family does, my mother whispered. And there it was. The line that explained every year of my life under that roof. That's what family does. Family covers. Family smooths. Family distributes pain downward toward the member most likely to survive it quietly. Family keeps the center bright. I looked at all three of them, then said the truest thing I had ever said in that house. No. They all went still. That's what machinery does. The room stayed silent. Because that word did what family language always fears most. It exposed function, not love, not support. Function. Ethan needed my mind. My parents needed Ethan's myth. My father needed a son worth betting on. My mother needed a story worth telling. And I had become the hidden structure that kept all of it from collapsing. I stood up. I'm not helping. My mother gasped. My father slammed his palm against the table. You are part of this family. I looked at him. No, I said. I was part of the system. Then I left. Ethan followed me outside. Of course he did. He always wanted the conversation after the conversation, the private correction, the smaller room, the chance to pull me back into function before my refusal hardened into reality. The porch light cast everything in a dull yellow haze. The neighborhood was quiet. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Someone 2 houses down was watching television through half-open curtains. Ordinary life surrounding extraordinary fraud. That is how family disasters usually happen. Not in darkness. In neighborhoods. Ava. I turned with my hand already on the car door. He came down the front steps slowly. Not polished now. Not charismatic. just angry and scared enough that the expensive language had started slipping out of him. You think you're above this? No. Yes, you do. That's not the issue. He laughed bitterly. It's always the issue with you. There it was again. My supposed judgment, my tone, my precision. Men like Ethan always try to turn your clarity into character flaw when they can no longer argue with the content. If this company dies, Dad loses everything, he said. I held his gaze. Yes. That answer stunned him. He had expected panic, or guilt, or some reflexive movement back towards saving. Not agreement. Because agreement meant I saw the consequences and was refusing to intervene anyway. You'd just watch that happen? I thought about all the years I had watched. The bridge, the proofs, the speeches, the applications, the proposal, the grant, the deck, the subtle theft of my intellectual life in exchange for family peace. Then I gave him the only honest answer. I already spent half my life watching things happen. He didn't understand. Or maybe he did, and hated that he did. People carried by invisible labor never notice the carrying itself. They only notice when the floor moves. I got in my car. As I pulled away, I looked once in the rearview mirror. He was still standing under the porch light. And for the first time in my life, my brother did not look brilliant. He looked exactly what he was. A man standing at the edge of a story he could not hold up alone. The next day, just before noon, I got the email. Not from Ethan. Not from my father. Not from my mother. From counsel. Martin Vale. It was brief, professional, cold in exactly the right way. He thanked me for my willingness to cooperate and asked if I would make myself available for a preliminary private review regarding authorship continuity and technical development sequence. There it was. Sequence. The word that kills people like Ethan. Not because sequence is cruel, because sequence is indifferent. It does not care who your parents loved more. It does not care how beautiful your mother set the table. It does not care how confidently you walked through the deck. It wants timestamps, draft chains, origination, continuity. And once sequence enters the story, atmosphere starts dying. Then came the line that turned my whole body cold. We have also begun consulting individuals involved in the original grant review process. I read that twice. Then again. Meaning this was no longer only about me, no longer just sibling testimony versus family denial. Other people had seen enough years ago to matter now. Other people had noticed the mismatch. The split between the technical architecture in writing and the man currently failing to speak it live. I sat back in my chair, very slowly, because that changed everything. If people in the original review process had left notes, concerns, observations, if there was institutional memory attached to the grant, then Ethan's whole adult mythology was standing on borrowed time. Not borrowed from me anymore, borrowed from the record itself. And records are much harder to bully than daughters. I wrote back with one word. Yes. Then I opened the old drive. Because if the story was finally going to be forced into sequence, I was done letting anyone else narrate it first. That night, as I sorted through years of files, drafts, emails, and buried version histories, I found something I had forgotten existed. An old grant review thread. One where Ethan had forwarded me a faculty question with a single line. Need answers fast. They're getting too granular. But that wasn't the part that made my hands go still. The part that mattered was what sat beneath it. My reply. 3 pages of technical explanation, my language, my logic, my structure. And at the bottom, a note I had written years earlier without realizing I was writing his ending. If they ask this live, Don't improvise. You won't survive follow-up questions. I stared at that sentence for a long time. Then my phone buzzed. A new text from Ethan. Only 6 words. Do not send them anything. And for the first time, I smiled. Because now I knew something he didn't. The room hadn't just started questioning the company. It had started questioning the origin of him. There is something uniquely horrifying about opening proof of your own erasure, not because the proof surprises you, because it confirms that your memory was never the problem. That night, after Ethan texted me, "Do not send them anything," I sat at my desk until the city outside my window disappeared into reflection, and my own face stared back at me from the glass. The drive was plugged in. Folders opened across my screen. High school. Applications. Capstone. Grant cycle. Early startup materials. The quiet fossil record of years I had spent pretending I was only helping. That was the first thing people always got wrong. They imagined some dramatic act of betrayal. A copied file, a stolen paper, a single sharp moment where one sibling clearly took something and the other clearly lost it. Real erasure is never that clean. Real erasure is iterative. It happens in margins, in revisions, in, "Can you just look at this?" In, "I only need your eyes for 5 minutes." In notes sent at 11:47 p.m. In documents that begin weak, pass through your mind, and re-emerge under someone else's name strong enough to collect applause. That is what the archive showed, not one theft. A system. I opened the oldest folders first, then forced myself to stop. The childhood material would prove pattern, yes, but pattern alone would let people sentimentalize this. Sibling dynamics, family roles, the usual soft phrases. No, if I was going to hand this over, it had to be structured the way serious people understand danger. Continuity, chronology, dependency, the Grant cycle first. That was the pivot point. That was where the family story stopped being embarrassing and started becoming valuable. I opened the core framework folder. Original creation date. My machine. 43 saved revisions, comment trails, intermediate model files, drafts attached to emails Ethan had later used in submissions. Then the grant committee questions, forwarded by Ethan with that line I could not stop staring at. Need answers fast. They're getting too granular. Granular. The perfect word for Ethan's entire problem. He could always survive broadness. He drowned in detail. And beneath that email sat my reply. 3 pages, threshold rationale, weighting logic, failure mode explanation, revised language for his submission. It was all there. Not just evidence that I had helped, evidence that I had built the exact parts of the thing that made serious people take him seriously. My phone vibrated. "Mom." I let it ring. Then she texted, "Please tell me you are not making this worse." Worse. That word again. For my family, truth only became worse when it threatened the comfort they had built around falsehood. I did not answer. I kept sorting. A capstone deck with my hidden notes still embedded in the speaker view. An application essay where his opening paragraph had started as my margin comment in an earlier draft. A model simulation file created on my laptop, then renamed and later referenced in a grant appendix under his materials. And the further I went, the uglier the pattern became. Not because it showed constant full authorship. That would have been easier to explain. No, it showed something more poisonous. Load-bearing intervention. The exact points where work turns from decorative to foundational. The points where a thing either stands or falls. Those points were mine, over and over again. Around midnight, I found the document that changed everything, not because it was the most dramatic, because it revealed intent. It was an old message thread from Ethan during the grant cycle. The committee had asked a follow-up technical question, a live one. They wanted verbal clarification. Ethan had messaged me. If they ask me this in person, what do I say? Below it was my answer. And beneath that, one final line from me, written years before I understood I was writing prophecy. Do not improvise. If they press follow-up, you won't survive it. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. The room was silent. The city was silent. Even the air felt still. Because in that moment, the entire future snapped into focus. He had always known. Not every detail. Not every technical layer. But he had known enough to know where the edge of his own understanding was. He had known where he needed me, and he had stepped over that line anyway. Again and again. That mattered. Because it meant this was not just unconscious entitlement. It was conscious reliance. He knew there were rooms he could not survive without me. He entered them anyway, and let everyone believe survival was proof of his brilliance. My phone vibrated again. This time it was Dad. Then a text. Whatever anger you have, do not make this public. I looked at the screen for a long moment, then finally laughed. Not kindly, because that sentence told me more than anything else had all day. He was no longer trying to deny the truth. He was trying to contain it, which meant the truth had already become too large for denial. It had crossed into risk. I turned my phone face down and kept working. At 1:12 a.m., an email arrived from Martin Vale. He thanked me for my willingness to cooperate, proposed a review window the following day, and added one line that made my pulse change. We have also reached out to one of the faculty members involved in the original grant review. I read that twice, then a third time, because now I understood. I was no longer the only witness, and once that happens, family myths start dying much faster. Her name was Professor Naomi Bell. I hadn't spoken to her in over a year. She had worked around Ethan during the grant review process, but more importantly, she had seen my work directly during a systems modeling project in my final year. She understood structure, which meant, unlike most people in Ethan's orbit, she would have heard the difference. Her message came at 8:06 the next morning. Ava, I think we should speak before the review. Please call when you can. I called immediately. She answered on the second ring. No small talk, no warm-up, just, Ava. Professor Bell. A pause. Then, I saw Ethan's statement. So he had posted again. Of course he had. When men like Ethan feel the room slipping, they always try to move the fight somewhere. Atmosphere still matters. Online, emotional framing can still buy sympathy for a few hours. In technical review, it dies. I'm sorry, I said. No, she replied quietly. What interests me is not the statement itself. It's what he's trying to preempt with it. That was why I trusted her instantly. She was not chasing tone. She was tracing pressure. I'll ask directly, she said. Did you contribute substantially more to that framework than people were told? I closed my eyes for a second, then answered the way truth deserves to be answered when the room is finally clean enough. Yes. Professor Bell exhaled. I thought so. That hurt more than I expected. Not because she believed me, because she had suspected years ago, which meant the split had been visible to someone beyond me. Not enough to stop anything. Not enough to save me from years of invisibility, but visible. What made you think that? I asked. The written architecture and Ethan's oral technical responses never matched cleanly, she said. He was excellent at conceptual framing, But when we asked him to move downward into mechanism, the coherence changed. There it was. The split again. The same thing the investor room had heard. The same thing I had lived with for years. Broadness, then drift, shine, then collapse. Did you document any of that? I asked. Yes, she said. My fingers tightened around the phone. How much? Committee notes. Not accusations, but enough to show concern about authorship continuity. Continuity. That word again. Clinical. Precise. Devastating. Not plagiarism in the cartoonish sense. Something more dangerous. A visible gap between the person in the room and the structure on the page. Professor Bell spoke again, softer now. I should have spoken to you then. I said nothing. Not because I wanted to punish her, because some late truths need silence around them to fully land. She did not rush to fill it. That mattered. Finally, she said, "If this goes formal, don't take them your pain first, take them your sequence." I sat up straighter. That was exactly right. Pain could be dismissed as bitterness. Sequence could not. Chronology, dependencies, origination, she continued. Make them walk through who built what and when. That is where his story will fail. I wrote the words down, even though I already knew them. Hearing them from someone outside the family made them harder, cleaner, more usable. Then she added one more thing. Be prepared for your family to act as though exposure itself is the crime. I almost smiled. They already are. I assumed, she said. Then after a pause. One more thing. If they are contacting grant reviewers now, they're no longer deciding whether to doubt him. They're deciding how far the doubt reaches. That sentence stayed with me long after the call ended. How far the doubt reaches? Not just Ethan, my father, his money, the company, its representations. Every room built on the original story. Everything. That afternoon, my mother called and asked me to come over just once. That phrase alone told me there was a document waiting. Families like mine always end up at paper when feelings stop working. If tears fail, they try language. If guilt fails, they try terms. If you will not disappear emotionally, they try to make you sign yourself out of the story structurally. I drove over just before sunset. The house looked exactly as it always had. White trim, clean windows, order, respectability. The porch steps swept as though no one inside had spent the last 48 hours panicking over legal exposure and a house tied to a son's false brilliance. My mother had set the dining room beautifully. Of course she had. Her good plates, candles, the cream linen runner she only used when she wanted a meal to feel important. Not warm, important. That was the thing about my mother. She believed aesthetics could civilize reality. If the room looked graceful enough, maybe the truth would lower its voice out of courtesy. My father stood near the sideboard holding a drink he hadn't really touched. Ethan was already seated. He looked exhausted. Not ashamed. Not yet. Just wrung out in the way people look when they've spent 2 days trying to get back in front of a story that is now running away from them. Sit, my father said. I sat. No one pretended this was dinner. My father slid a single page across the table. We spoke to counsel, he said. I picked it up. And there it was. The most polished lie I had ever seen in my life. Not a crude denial. Worse, a dilution. It acknowledged that I had provided occasional analytical support to Ethan during formative phases of development. Occasional, analytical support. Then it clarified that Ethan remained the principal visionary architect and founder, while my role had been that of a highly capable sibling offering valuable informal contribution. highly capable sibling, valuable informal contribution. I read the page twice, then once more. It was almost beautiful in its cruelty, because it offered me just enough language to feel seen while preserving exactly what had always mattered most to them. The center of the myth remained Ethan. I set the statement down. My mother leaned forward. "It's fair." I looked at her. "No," I said. "It's survivable." Her eyes filled instantly. My father's jaw tightened. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Play with words." I actually laughed, because language was all they had been doing for years. Support instead of structure. Help instead of authorship. Family instead of machinery. Now that the room had finally become expensive, suddenly he wanted words to stop mattering. "What happens if I sign this?" I asked. "It stabilizes the situation," my father said. There it was. The truth. Not peace, not honesty, stabilization, meaning the company, the investors, the liabilities, the house. I turned to Ethan. He had said almost nothing. Now he spoke in that low, carefully controlled voice he used when he wanted to sound humbled, without actually surrendering anything. "We all know you mattered." For 1 second, I could not speak. That sentence was almost worse than everything else, because even now, after years of disappearance, he still thought the injury was insufficient acknowledgement, as if a late nod under pressure could repair authorship, as if this had ever been about praise. No, this was about structure. I reached into my bag and pulled out my laptop. My mother whispered my name. My father stood up. Ethan's shoulders tightened. I opened the grant thread, then the framework version history, then the capstone notes, then the comment trails, then the old message. "If they ask this live, don't improvise. You won't survive follow-up questions." No one spoke. I let the silence sit. Then I said quietly, "You want me to sign a page that turns years of load-bearing work into occasional support." My father snapped, "That's enough." "No," I said, "it isn't." And something changed then. Not in them. In me. For years, their panic had worked because some piece of me still felt responsible for the emotional weather of the room. That piece was gone now. I looked at my mother. "You knew enough not to look too closely." Then my father. "You needed him to be worth the risk." Then Ethan. "And you needed me to stay hidden." No one denied it. That was the part I remember most. Not shouting, not crying, the absence of denial. I took the statement in both hands and tore it cleanly in half. My mother gasped. My father swore under his breath. Then I tore the halves again and left the pieces on the table. "You don't want truth," I said. "You want dilution." Then I stood and walked out. The review happened 2 days later. Private, small, formal enough to matter. "Not yet adversarial," Martin's email had said. That phrase stayed with me. Not yet adversarial. Meaning there was still a chance, however faint, for the record to be clarified before it hardened into something uglier. The room was downtown. Glass walls, muted art, polished surfaces that said competence in the cold, expensive way only certain offices do. I arrived early. Not because I was nervous, because I wanted those 10 quiet minutes before Ethan entered. I wanted to stand in a room where family mythology had no physical presence, no mother, no father, no emotional translation, just documents, questions, sequence. When the others entered, Ethan came first. Dark suit, controlled expression, the founder costume still intact. That struck me. Even now. Even here. He still dressed like the story could save him. Martin Vale introduced the investors, Warren and Lydia. Then Dr. Annika Sloan, the outside technical advisor. She had clear gray eyes and the kind of stillness that made me trust her immediately. People who need fewer words tend to survive closer to truth. Once everyone sat down, Martin began. This meeting concerns authorship continuity and technical representation issues associated with prior investment communications. Continuity again. There was the right word. Not credit. Not family conflict. Continuity. Did the same mind appear at the beginning and the end? Was the origin story structurally honest? He turned to Ethan first. Mr. Cole, you have consistently represented yourself as the principal originator of the framework underlying the company's predictive architecture. Ethan nodded. Yes. Then Martin turned to me. Ms. Cole, you have indicated that your contribution was materially more substantial than informal support. Yes. No trembling, no speech. Just yes. Then Dr. Sloan opened her folder and asked the question, not dramatic, not impossible, just specific enough to draw blood. When the original framework weighted volatility events against root priority conflicts, what was the rationale for the asymmetrical correction threshold in second-stage logic? I watched Ethan's face. There are pauses you only recognize after years of helping someone simulate fluency. The pause before they choose language instead of understanding. The pause before they surf outward because they cannot go down. He answered exactly as I knew he would. Broadly. Beautifully. Wrong. It was designed to preserve adaptive flexibility under changing disruption conditions while maintaining predictive stability. Dr. Sloan looked at him for one beat and said, "That is not an answer." The room changed. Tiny shift, massive consequence. Because once someone like her says that, the air itself becomes less forgiving. She turned to me. Can you answer it? I looked at Ethan first, then at her. Yes, I said. And when I answered, the room finally heard me the way it had heard him for years. After I explained the threshold logic cleanly, Dr. Sloan asked me a second question, then a third. I answered all three. Then Martin asked for the documentary trail. I placed the drive on the table, and just as I opened the first email chain, Ethan's phone lit up. 3 calls in a row, from my father. Then a text preview flashed across the screen. Only part of it was visible, but part was enough. Do not let her control. Martin looked at the phone, then at Ethan, and in that exact moment the room stopped seeing this as a founder with a bad demo. It started seeing something much worse, a family trying to manage the collapse of a lie. There are rooms where people are still deciding whether to be polite, and there are rooms where politeness has already lost. The moment my father's name lit up on Ethan's phone for the third time, politeness lost. It did not disappear dramatically. No one raised their voice. No one leaned forward. No one said, "Aha, so this is fraud." It changed more quietly than that. The temperature shifted. The kind of shift you only notice if you have spent years watching admiration evaporate out of faces. Martin Vale looked at the phone, then at Ethan, then at me, then back at the phone again. The text preview was still faintly visible on the locked screen. Do not let her control. That was all the room got. It was enough. Martin extended his hand. Mr. Cole. It wasn't a request. Not really. Warren said nothing, which made the silence worse. Lydia's expression changed by maybe half a degree. Dr. Sloan simply sat still. That was the thing about serious rooms. The more dangerous they become, the less theatrical they get. Ethan swallowed. Then, because he knew refusal would make him look even more compromised than compliance already had, he turned the phone and handed it over. Martin looked at the screen for a few seconds. Then he placed it face down on the table. Is your father involved in communication strategy concerning the issues under review? Ethan inhaled once, sharply. No. Martin didn't move. The room did not move. Then Martin said in exactly the same tone, "Would you like to answer that again?" That sentence hit harder than almost anything else said all day. Not because it was loud, because it was procedural. Controlled. The kind of sentence that tells you a room has stopped treating your answers as trustworthy by default. Ethan stared at the table, then said, "He's trying to protect the family." There it was. Not a company issue, not a technical issue, not a documentation issue. The family. The sacred container my parents had used my entire life to excuse whatever version of Ethan needed protecting that week. Martin folded his hands. Is he advising you on how to characterize Ms. Cole's role? Ethan hesitated. Too long. Then, he's trying to keep things from spiraling. Warren finally spoke. His voice was almost soft. Spiraling from what? That question sat in the room like a blade, because there was no safe answer. Spiraling from misunderstanding would be one thing. Spiraling from scrutiny was another. Spiraling from the discovery that the supposed founder could not explain the architecture attached to his credibility, that was something else entirely. Ethan looked up, then down again. He said nothing. And in that silence, the room made its own conclusion. Martin turned toward me. "Ms. Cole, please continue with the documentation." So I did. There is a difference between telling the truth and proving sequence. The first is emotional, the second is fatal. For years, Ethan had survived because the truth around him existed in human memory. Mine, my mother's suspicions, my father's selective blindness, his own entitlement. All of that is powerful inside a family and weak outside one. Sequence is different. Sequence lives in places people like Ethan forget to fear until it is too late. Creation dates, revision chains, embedded comments, export history, forwarded questions, attached drafts. The dead, boring mechanics of authorship. I opened the first folder and projected the version history onto the screen. This is the original framework development chain tied to the grant cycle, I said. No flourish, no speech, just fact. Martin watched carefully. Dr. Sloan leaned in slightly. Warren crossed one ankle over the other and looked less like an investor now, and more like a man assessing whether he had been insulted. That distinction mattered. Investors can recover from bad bets. They dislike realizing the bet required them to suspend obvious questions. I clicked through the versions. Draft 1, Draft 2, Draft 8, Draft 17, Draft 43. Each with timestamps. Each with my device history. Each with internal notes refining the exact logic Ethan had later presented as natural output of his own mind. I opened the comment pane. My notes appeared in the margin. Reweight instability cost here. Symmetrical threshold breaks under upstream congestion. This fails if recovery burden is treated as equivalent. Too vague. Tighten mechanism language. Do not overstate predictive confidence. The room stayed silent. That silence was good. Silence meant no one needed the emotional wrapper anymore. The files were doing the work. Then I opened the grant committee thread. The original question. Ethan forwarding it to me. Need answers fast. They're getting too granular. Lydia let out the smallest visible exhale. Not quite irritation. Recognition. That line told her everything she needed to know about the dependency pattern. He had not reached out after a little confusion. He had routed the difficult layer downward the moment scrutiny got too specific. Then my reply. 3 pages of technical clarification. Structured. Clean, not emotional, not advisory in the loose family sense. Load-bearing. The exact kind of work a real founder would have had to do himself if the story had been true. Martin asked, "To your knowledge, were these responses incorporated into the official grant follow-up?" "Yes. Directly? In some places. In others, softened into his tone." That distinction mattered, because people always imagine theft as direct copy-paste. Often it's not. Often the more damaging version is conceptual laundering. One person builds the internal structure. Another rephrases it just enough to make the thinking feel native on his tongue. That was Ethan's specialty. Not invention. Assimilation. He could wear my precision after I built it. He just couldn't generate it on demand in a room that pressed downward fast enough. Dr. Sloan asked, "Were you credited at any point in connection with this framework?" "No." "Were you consulted repeatedly for clarification during the grant review?" "Yes." "Were those consultations visible to the committee?" "No." She nodded once. That nod mattered more than sympathy would have. It meant she understood the category of harm. Hidden technical dependency falsely attributed to a visible public principle. Martin asked Ethan, "Do you dispute Ms. Cole's characterization of these materials?" There was a pause. Then Ethan said, "I don't dispute that she helped." Helped? There it was again. The word he always used when he wanted scale to disappear. A skyscraper translated into a favor. My jaw tightened, but I said nothing. I didn't need to. Dr. Sloan did it for me. "That word is no longer sufficient," she said. The room went still again. Then she looked at Ethan directly. "What we are evaluating here is not whether your sister was helpful." A beat. "We are evaluating whether the technical credibility attached to your role was materially dependent on work the market was not told came from someone else." That was the sentence. The cleanest one yet. Not sibling support. Not misunderstanding. Not bruised family ego. Market-facing credibility built on uncredited intellectual load-bearing work. Warren leaned back in his chair, and for the first time all meeting he looked openly annoyed. Not with me. With Ethan. That was new. And I knew enough about rooms like that to understand how dangerous it was. Annoyed people start asking shorter questions. Short questions hurt more. He asked one then. How often? No one clarified. No one needed to. How often had I done this? How often had Ethan depended on invisible work while selling visible brilliance? I answered carefully. Repeatedly over several years, with increasing stakes. How far back? At least to late high school. That answer landed heavily, because everyone in the room had been thinking startup, grant, foundership, recent misrepresentation. Late high school changed the emotional scale. It meant this wasn't a young founder who got sloppy under pressure. It was a long pattern of identity built through hidden borrowing. Martin looked at Ethan. Is that inaccurate? Ethan's hands were clasped too tightly now. No. That one word made Lydia sit forward for the first time. Because once pattern enters the room, people stop asking whether they were misled once. They start wondering what else in the story was staged on top of it. There is always one question in a collapse that matters more than the rest, not because it contains the most information, because it forces motive into the open. Up until that point, Ethan still had small hiding places: confusion, over-reliance, blurred boundaries, family messiness, poor judgment, the kinds of phrases people use when they are still searching for a less humiliating moral category. Then Warren asked, "When did you understand that the market was believing something about your technical authorship that was not fully true?" That was the question. Not whether I helped. Not whether he overused my work. Not whether the room had gone badly. When did he know the outside story had become false and continue anyway? Ethan looked at Warren, then at Martin, then at me. He licked his lips once. A tiny gesture. Human. Panicked. He tried the first escape route. It wasn't that simple. Warren did not move. Then make it simple. That line almost startled me, because it was so close to something I had wanted to say to Ethan for years. Make it simple. Strip the family language away. Strip the performance away. Strip the atmosphere away. What happened? He looked at the table again. I knew what he was doing. Searching for phrasing. Not truth. Phrasing. Men like Ethan believe language can still save them long after structure has abandoned them. Finally, he said, "It evolved." Martin spoke before anyone else could. What evolved? My role. No one interrupted him, so he kept talking. At first, it was normal. Siblings help each other. Then the work got bigger. Then people started assuming things. Then it was already moving. Already moving. There was something pathetic about the phrase, as if the lie were a river he had slipped into and simply failed to get out of in time. Warren said, "Assuming what?" Ethan's voice got quieter. That I was the primary technical mind. That sentence sat there, undressed, at last. Martin asked the next question immediately. And when did you realize that assumption had become materially important to your opportunities? Ethan did not answer, then did. By the grant. There it was. The point of knowing. Not innocent drift. Not blur. By the grant. He knew by then. He knew the room was seeing him as something he could not sustain without me. He moved forward anyway, and the grant was exactly when the story became profitable, which meant the knowing and the benefit arrived together. I watched Martin write that down. Carefully, slowly, as if he understood how much changed with that one admission. Because now the story had a line. Before the line, maybe there was family confusion. After the line, there was conscious use. Warren asked, "Why continue?" And that was the question that broke him. Because he could not answer it in business language, could not answer it in startup language, could not answer it in family language. The truth was uglier than all of those. He looked at me while he said it, and for the first time in the room, I saw no performance at all, only naked fear. Because if people knew she was behind the technical side, he said quietly, they would have seen me differently. Silence. He went on. As soon as the grant happened, as soon as investors got interested, as soon as professors started treating me like... He stopped. Like what? A prodigy? A systems mind? A visionary? A son worth refinancing a house for? He didn't need to finish. The room understood. So did I. That was it. Not greed, exactly. Not even ambition in the normal sense. Identity addiction. He had been seen in a flattering shape and would do whatever was necessary to keep the room from recalibrating. My invisibility was the price of his proportion staying wrong. Dr. Sloan asked softly, "Different how?" He answered without looking away from me, "Less inevitable." That word hit me harder than anything else he'd said, because it was my father's word too. Inevitable. The future. The chosen one. The genius son. That one word contained the entire family religion, and Ethan had known it. Known what he was protecting. Known what I was paying for. Known what he was doing when he let it continue. For a second, nobody spoke. Then Martin said, "Thank you." And those two words felt colder than accusation, because once rooms like that begin thanking you for honesty, It means they are finished offering you softer categories. After that, the rest of the meeting was not dramatic. It was worse. It became procedural, which is another way of saying the room stopped wondering whether Ethan might still be recoverable in his current narrative and started deciding how to document the collapse cleanly. Preservation directives, imaging procedures, communications review, independent technical comparison. Martin's voice never changed. That was the cruelty of professional rooms. Once they believe they have found the center of the problem, they become almost kind in tone. They do not need emotion anymore. They have classification. Warren asked whether any external representations had described Ethan as sole creator or principal originator without qualification. Lydia asked whether investors had been led to believe the technical architecture reflected a continuity of authorship that no longer appeared reliable. Dr. Sloan asked whether Ethan could identify, without prompts, which specific areas of the framework were structurally dependent on my design choices rather than his later language layers. He could not. That was the detail that finally killed whatever little sympathy remained in the room. Not the admissions, not even the concealment. The fact that he still did not know the edges of his own dependence. He could not map the theft from inside it. He only knew when the performance started slipping and where to send the files afterward. That was when Warren's expression went from disappointment to contempt. Very slight. But I saw it, and Ethan saw it too. Because people like Ethan survive on the emotional atmosphere of rooms. They feel changes in admiration faster than most people feel, temperature shifts. By the end, no one looked at him the way they had at the beginning. That mattered more than any single sentence. At the start of the meeting, he had still entered as a founder under scrutiny. By the end, he was a man who had used hidden authorship to manufacture technical credibility and then tried to protect the resulting fiction through family coordination. Those are not the same category of person, and rooms built around money know the difference. When it was over, Martin stood first. "Thank you both," he said. The phrasing was interesting. Both, neutral, controlled. And yet everyone knew the balance in that word had changed completely. Warren nodded to me once. Not sympathy. Recognition. Lydia gathered her papers and avoided looking at Ethan directly. Dr. Sloan closed her folder and said only one thing before leaving. "Mechanics always surface eventually." I never forgot that line, because she wasn't talking about logistics architecture. She was talking about people. The hidden operating logic of a family, a lie, a dependency, a myth. Eventually, the mechanics surface. Then everyone was gone, except Ethan and me. He stayed seated. For a moment, I thought he might not say anything. Then he laughed. One short, dry, disbelieving sound. "You really did it?" I picked up my bag. "No." He looked up sharply. "Yes, you did." I looked at him, at the expensive suit, at the exhaustion, at the face I had spent half my life helping the world admire. "You think this started today?" He said nothing. "It started every time you took something and decided my silence was part of the cost." His mouth tightened. "You wanted them to hate me." No. Hatred would have been easier for him. Hatred would have made me the problem. Hatred would have given him another story. I shook my head. "I wanted them to see you." That hurt him more, because being hated still leaves the image intact. Being seen destroys it from the inside. He looked away, then said, almost tired enough to be honest, "You could have just let it go." I almost smiled. Of course. Of course that was the sentence, the one my whole family had always believed. Let it go. Let the school project go. Let the speech go. Let the application go. Let the capstone go. Let the grant go. Let the startup go. Let your own authorship go if the family needs the brighter story more. No, I said quietly. You should have let it stop. For a second, I thought he might say something true. Not sorry. He wasn't built for that cleanly, but maybe something like I know. Instead, he asked the question that proved how deeply he had misunderstood our entire lives. You needed me too, didn't you? I stared at him. Because there it was. The deepest lie beneath all the others. That because I had stayed in the walls so long, I must have needed the structure too. Maybe part of me had once needed the peace of not fighting. Maybe invisibility can become its own cage because it feels safer than open war. But no, I had not needed Ethan. I had survived him. You have no idea who I am without cleaning up after you, I said. Then I left him there, alone, for the first time in his life, in a room where the story had stopped cushioning him. By evening, he did what I knew he would do. He posted, not a full defense, nothing so crude, something softer, more wounded, more strategic. A statement about the painful complexity of family contribution in high-pressure environments. A line about private support being reframed publicly in ways that distort collaboration. Another about resentment attaching itself to success stories after the fact. The moment I read it, I understood exactly what he was trying to do. He wanted to move the war out of sequence and back into atmosphere, back into emotion, back into the kind of room where people still believe tone is evidence. For a few hours, it almost worked. People responded with sympathy, soft comments, generic encouragement. Strangers love phrases like family complexity because they allow everyone to project their own wounds into someone else's ambiguity. But then the question started. What exactly was under review? Why were investors examining authorship continuity? If this was merely family support, why were there original file concerns at all? Why had his technical answers broken down in private review? He answered none of them, because specifics were poison to him now. And the silence beneath those questions began doing to his public image what scrutiny had already done in the room. Cooling it, shaping it, changing the temperature. That was when Daniel Mercer called. He had been at the demo and had, over the last week, become one of those peripheral witnesses who understood enough to know where the story was heading. It's spreading, he said. How far? Far enough. Meaning professional circles had started talking. Quietly, the way useful warnings move. Not scandal. Not yet. Something worse. Caution. Anything official? I asked. Not public, he said. But investor interest is freezing. People are comparing stories. Comparing stories. That phrase mattered. Because comparison is what kills liars fastest. A single story can survive a long time. 3 conflicting ones in the same room cannot, Daniel continued. Also, there's concern your father may have made this worse. Of course, because my father could not bear to let the structure answer for itself. He had to reach into the room through Ethan's phone. He had to try to keep controlling the story. He had done the only thing more damaging than silence. He had made panic visible. That night, my father called 12 times. My mother texted 6. Ethan didn't contact me at all. That bothered me. Not because I missed him. Because silence from men like Ethan often means they are thinking in directions no one else is seeing yet. They are dangerous when the image breaks and no new one has been stabilized. The last message of the night came from my mother. Only one line. He says everything is over. Please answer. I stared at it for a long time, then turned off my phone, 'cause I knew something she still didn't. This wasn't over. Not even close. The room had seen him, Now the world around the room would start adjusting, and once enough people adjust at once. The collapse stops belonging to family. It becomes reality. The next morning, my mother showed up at my apartment without warning. No makeup, no performance, no pie in her hands. Just fear. Real fear. And after she sat down in my kitchen and looked at the floor for almost a full minute, she said the sentence I had waited years to hear. I knew more than I ever admitted. Then she looked up at me with tears in her eyes and whispered, "Your father asked Ethan last night if any of it had ever really been his." When I opened the door, I almost didn't recognize her. Not because she looked physically different, because she looked unguarded. My mother had spent most of her life arranged. Hair in place, voice in place, smile in place. Emotion always visible, yes, but visible in ways that still serve the room. Even her sadness usually had a shape to it, a presentation, a grace, a way of making pain look almost elegant. Not that morning. That morning, she looked like someone who had run out of furniture to stand behind. No makeup. Hair pinned back badly as if she'd done it with shaking hands. Eyes swollen. Coat still half-buttoned wrong. She walked into my apartment without asking and stood in the middle of the kitchen like she had forgotten what kitchens were for. I closed the door. She did not sit immediately. She just stood there, twisting her hands together, looking at the floorboards as though something beneath them might tell her how to speak next. "Ava," she said. Then nothing. I waited. Because there are moments when silence is not avoidance. Silence is mercy. If I had interrupted her, she would have retreated into phrasing, into the old family language, support, misunderstanding, pressure, help. No. If she was going to say something true, it had to arrive without me cushioning the room for her. She finally sat down at the kitchen table. Not gracefully, heavily, like something in her body had stopped pretending to be lighter than it was. Then she looked at me and said, "I knew more than I ever admitted." There it was. The sentence I had wanted for years and stopped expecting long before it arrived. Not because it healed anything, because it named something cleanly. And after a lifetime of being erased under soft language, clean naming feels almost violent in its relief. I sat across from her and said nothing. She kept going. "Not everything," she said quickly, the reflex still there, trying to trim the edges of guilt before it fully reached her. "But enough. Enough." That word mattered, because enough is where moral failure lives most often. Not complete knowledge, not total innocence, enough to suspect, enough to notice, enough to ask better questions and choose not to. Her fingers tightened around each other. "I knew he came to you too often," she said. I looked at her. She didn't look away. Not yet. "I knew his work changed after he talked to you. I knew some of his ideas sounded more like you than him. I knew there were times he looked lost. Until he came out of a room with you." Each sentence landed like a small stone. Not new information. Worse, confirmation. Because there is a specific kind of damage in discovering that the people who claim not to know were actually standing just one layer away from full recognition the whole time. They were not blind. They were avoiding sight. "And you said nothing," I said. My voice sounded almost calm. That surprised me. She nodded once. Then tears slipped down her face. Quiet tears, not dramatic, not persuasive. Just the body finally paying for a lie the mouth maintained too long. "I told myself that's how siblings worked," she whispered. "No," I said. The word came out harder than I intended, then softer. "No." She looked down. "I know." That sentence nearly broke me, not because it was enough, because it was real. For years, my mother had lived in euphemisms. Now she had finally stepped outside one. I leaned back in my chair. The kitchen was very still. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a truck backed up with a faint mechanical beep. Ordinary life was still happening. That always feels obscene when something foundational finally gets named. "How much did Dad tell you?" I asked. "At first?" "At all." She wiped under one eye with the heel of her hand. "Not everything. Not toward the end." That sounded true. My father did not mind sharing optimism. He hated sharing exposure. "Did you know about the refinance before it happened?" A longer pause. Then, "Yes." That one landed deeper than the rest, because if she knew before it happened, then there had been a moment, a decision point, a space where reality might still have been forced into the room before debt entered the lie. And she had let it happen anyway. Not because she believed the numbers, because she needed the story. I saw her understand that I understood. And for the first time since she arrived, her expression changed from guilt into something worse. Shame. "I thought it would work," she whispered. "No," I said quietly. "You thought it had to work." She shut her eyes. And that was the heart of it. Not confidence, need. My father needed a son worth betting on. My mother needed a child worth presenting to the world as evidence of meaning. Ethan needed an identity larger than his actual scale. And I had spent years feeding the machine because some part of me believed surviving quietly inside it was less dangerous than tearing it open. We had not all suffered equally. That matters. But we had all lived inside the same structure. The difference was that I had been the one hidden in the walls of it. My mother opened her eyes and looked at me with raw fear. "Your father asked Ethan last night if any of it had ever really been his." There it was, the sentence, the one that should have been asked when we were children, at the bridge, at the proofs, at the speeches, at the application essays, at the grant, at every point where the room had mistaken polished delivery for origin. Any of it. Had any of it ever really been his? I said nothing. Because what could I say to that? Only time, maybe. Only rage. Only years too late. "What did Ethan say?" I asked. My mother laughed once. It was not a pleasant sound. It sounded like something fraying. "He said it didn't matter." I stared at her. She nodded as she cried. "He said what mattered was that he could carry it, that people believed him, that once the opportunities came, the distinction stopped mattering." There it was. The cleanest confession yet. Maybe not in a legal sense, in a moral one. The distinction stopped mattering. Of course it had. That was the whole architecture of his life. Origin didn't matter. Only possession. Only presentation. Only who the room stayed pointed at long enough for admiration to become investment. My mother wiped her face again. "Your father asked him if he had ever once planned to tell the truth." I could already guess the answer. "He said there was never a right time." That line almost made me smile, because it was so ordinary, so cowardly, so painfully predictable. There is never a right time to stop benefiting from a lie you have already started building around. That is how lies survive. By convincing everyone they can be corrected later, after one more opportunity, one more room, one more win, one more round of funding, one more delay. Later is the most profitable word in family dysfunction. My mother looked up at me with a face I had never seen before. Not theatrical grief, not maternal indignation, helplessness. "What do I do?" she asked. And that was the moment I understood just how completely the old hierarchy had broken. Because for the first time in my life, my mother was not asking how to smooth something. She was asking because she truly did not know what reality required. And I, the steady one, the practical one, the one no one ever built the family around, was the only person in the room who had known for years what the structure was made of. "You stop calling it love," I said. She flinched. I kept going. "You stop calling it support. You stop calling it family. You stop using warm words for things that hollowed everyone out." Her mouth trembled. And because I was not cruel enough to leave her there entirely without mercy, I added, "And you stop trying to save this in the shape it used to be." That made her cry harder. But she didn't argue, because somewhere underneath all the years of curation and denial and emotional varnish, I think she finally knew I was right. My mother stayed for almost an hour, long enough to tell me pieces. Not everything, but enough to reconstruct the night after the meeting. My father had come home furious, not loud at first. That wasn't his style. My father did not begin with volume. He began with control sharpened into something metallic. He had gone into the study and shut the door. Ethan followed him 10 minutes later. My mother stayed in the kitchen. She claimed she did not mean to listen. I believed that, mostly. But houses carry voices strangely when the people inside them have spent years pretending not to hear one another clearly. She heard enough. My father had asked Ethan how much he had known. Not about the current mess, about all of it. How long had he known the image people were buying didn't match the work? How long had he known Ava was load-bearing? How long had he known the grant had crossed the line from family help into misrepresentation? And Ethan, apparently cornered enough to stop performing for at least a few minutes, had answered badly. Not by lying well, by telling the truth in fragments, the grant, the capstone, maybe some things before that. Nothing total, nothing he could not still emotionally justify to himself as normal, but enough. Enough that my father finally had to look at his son and see not just a bad founder or an overhyped dream, but a man who had knowingly let his family leverage itself into a false image. That broke something in him. Not morally, not beautifully. Financially first, then emotionally. There is a specific sound men like my father make when money and pride collapse at the same time. My mother imitated it once in the kitchen. Not the words, just the sound. A flat, stunned breath. As if the chest itself suddenly has nowhere stable left to set its weight. Then my father asked the question again. Any of it. Had any of it ever really been his? And when Ethan said that the distinction stopped mattering once people believed, my father lost whatever illusion he had still been protecting. He told Ethan to get out. Not forever. Not in some cinematic exile scene. Something uglier. Smaller. More ordinary. Get out of my sight. That was the phrase? My mother repeated it softly, like she still couldn't believe she'd heard it. Then she said something else. He looked old. Dad? She nodded. Not angry old, defeated old. That image stayed with me longer than I expected. Because my father had never built himself around Ethan only as a son. He had built himself around Ethan as evidence, proof that he had seen something early and correctly, proof that his instincts were sound, proof that his family line was moving toward a future worth revering. To lose Ethan's image was one thing. To lose the judgment that image had reflected back on him was another. That is what really broke him. Not just the money, the self-portrait underneath it. My mother left around noon. Before she went, she turned in the doorway and said, "I don't think he knows who he is without all of it." I almost asked which he she meant, my father or Ethan, but I didn't, because the truth was crueler than the question. Both. The first week after the review still felt unreal. Nothing public, no headlines, no formal statement, no clean, satisfying event where the world suddenly aligned with the truth I had lived with for years. That is not how collapse works when money is involved. Collapse begins in polite language, with pauses, with requests for more time, with calendars that suddenly need to be revisited, with people who were very enthusiastic becoming currently unable to proceed. By Monday, one investor had pulled out entirely. By Tuesday, two others had frozen conversations pending internal evaluation of continuity concerns. I heard that phrase from Daniel Mercer, who called me from his car on the way back from what he described as a very uncomfortable lunch. Continuity concerns, he repeated, almost amused by the dryness of it. That's what they're calling it now. What are they really calling it? I asked. He was quiet for a second, then, that depends on who you ask. And if I asked you? I'd say they think he sold the market a technical identity he couldn't personally substantiate. That was the cleanest version of the truth I had heard from someone outside the family yet. Not plagiarism, not complete fabrication, a sold identity. Exactly. And the company? I asked. Daniel exhaled. It was already weak. This just removed the one thing keeping people patient. There it was. Patience. That is what charisma buys fragile founders. Time, not structure, not substance, just time. And once time gets revoked, weakness starts aging in public very fast. What about my father? I asked. Daniel hesitated, then said, people know he's exposed. How much do they know? Enough to know it's not trivial. I looked out my office window at the buildings across the street. Office lights, moving silhouettes, screens glowing blue through glass. Normal life, again, continuing with the obscene indifference it always brings to private catastrophe. Are they talking about him as part of this? I asked. Yes. Not loudly, not yet. But yes, that made sense. Because money hates fathers who interfere emotionally in professional damage control. A founder in trouble is bad enough. A father visibly trying to manipulate the story from the edges of a review room makes everything look smaller, weaker, more desperate. Family cult energy repels capital very quickly once it becomes visible. Daniel said one more thing before hanging up. He posted again, didn't he? I had seen the draft version through a mutual contact already. Yes. Daniel laughed without humor. He's trying to make this about family pain becoming public spectacle. Of course he was. Men like Ethan always run to pain language when structure turns against them. Pain is sympathetic. Mechanics are not. The post went live that evening. It was shorter than the last one, more emotional, more stripped down, less polished, which meant someone had worked hard to make it sound that way. He wrote about expectation, pressure, loneliness, the burden of being misunderstood by the people closest to you. He wrote about the cruelty of having private family support reinterpreted through the lens of resentment. That line almost made me throw my phone, not because it was surprising, because it was shameless enough to impress me. There he was again, trying to turn authorship into support into emotional ambiguity, and my years of structural labor into a family mood. Then came the line that told me he was still trying to save the center at all costs. Many people contribute to success stories. Contribution is not the same as ownership. I stared at that sentence for a long time, because there it was, the final mask. Yes, others contributed. Yes, my sister mattered. But ownership remains mine. No, not this time. The comments under the post were different now. Not blindly supportive, not attacking either. Which was worse for him? Measured, cool, questioning. Who exactly contributed? Why were investors reviewing authorship continuity? Why had technical concerns suddenly become central if this was just a family misunderstanding? Why did the language keep getting vaguer as the scrutiny got sharper? He answered none of it. By then, the room online was beginning to behave like the room in review had. The more specific the questions became, the less space he had to move. He called after Ethan's second post went live. I knew it was him before I answered, because no one else in my life called 3 times in 2 minutes. When I picked up, he didn't say hello. What do you want? The question was so naked it almost sounded childish. Not, why are you doing this? Not what happens now. Not can we talk? Just, what do you want? As if some clear, selfish appetite had to sit at the center of this for him to survive it. I sat on my couch and looked at the city lights through the glass. The truth. No, he snapped. That's not what this is. That sentence told me everything. He had reached the stage where evidence no longer threatened him primarily as fact. It threatened him as humiliation. And humiliation always looks for motive in the person naming the truth, because motive is easier to attack than sequence. You couldn't stand it, he said. Not one more success, not one more room choosing him, not one more person believing in him more than you. I closed my eyes. There it was. Even now. Even after the drive, the review, the files, the version histories, the grant notes, the investor pullback, the house. He still needed me to be bitter, because bitter daughters are easier to explain than foolish fathers. That's easier for you, isn't it? I said quietly. What? Believing I'm jealous? Silence. I kept going. Because if I'm jealous, then you were merely unfair. He said nothing. But if I'm right, then you gambled your family's house on a myth because you wanted a son worth worshipping more than you wanted the truth. That landed. He did not hang up. He just breathed. And for a moment I heard something I had never heard from my father before. Not anger, not discipline, defeat trying not to sound like defeat. He was supposed to become something, he said. I looked out at my reflection in the dark window. He could have. The answer surprised him. What? He could have become something, I said again. If any of you had ever forced him to stand on his own work. That was the tragedy, wasn't it? Ethan was not empty. That would have made this simpler. He had enough intelligence to become competent, enough charm to become dangerous, enough ambition to build a decent life. What he lacked was the one thing my family's worship made impossible: proportion. He had never been required to exist at actual scale. My father's voice dropped. Then why didn't you help him become that? I almost laughed, because fathers always ask that question after they have spent years rewarding the opposite. As if the daughter trained into invisibility was permanently responsible for the son trained into entitlement. I did, I said, for years. Then I ended the call. He emailed me 2 nights later. Not text, not call, email. That told me he wanted distance, record, formality. Some final attempt to control the frame. The message was short. We need to meet. In person. No one else. There are things I need to say that I won't put in writing. I stared at it for a long time. Every instinct I had said no. Men like Ethan are most dangerous after the room has turned and before a new identity has settled. This was the stretch where shame mutates, where panic becomes invention, where people reach for the last story that might still save them. But I said yes, not because I trusted him, because endings matter. and some endings have to be witnessed to become real. We agreed to meet at a quiet place by the river the following evening. When I arrived, he was already there. No suit, no founder costume, no glossy watch-catching light. Just a dark sweater, tired eyes, and the posture of a man who had not slept enough to arrange himself properly. That unsettled me more than anger would have, because Ethan without presentation looked suddenly younger and older at the same time. Younger in vulnerability, older in damage. I sat across from him. Neither of us touched the menus. Neither of us smiled. He looked at the table first, then said, "It's done." I waited. The company's dead. His voice was flat. No self-pity yet. That surprised me. One investor is gone. The others won't even say no clearly anymore. They're just disappearing. That tracked. Money rarely slams the door. It just leaves you standing in a hallway too long. "My father won't answer my calls," he added. I said nothing. "My mother keeps trying to mediate." Of course she did. Even at the edge of collapse, some women cannot stop trying to turn structural consequences into family dialogue. Then he looked at me and asked the question I knew had been waiting under everything. "Why did you keep helping me for so long if you hated it?" The question almost made me sad, because even now, even here, he still thought the story started with hatred, as if resistance only becomes real when it announces itself loudly enough. I folded my hands loosely in my lap. "I didn't hate you at first." He blinked. That answer surprised him. "I pitied you." His jaw tightened. I continued. "You were the child everyone projected onto. I saw that before you did." He looked away. "And for a while, helping you felt easier than fighting all of them." That was the closest I had ever come to saying the ugliest part out loud. That invisibility can become its own survival strategy. Not because it's good, because open war inside a family like ours is exhausting, and sometimes quiet complicity feels less painful in the short term. He asked softly, "So this is their fault?" "No." I said it immediately. "No." He looked up. "They built the myth," I said. "You chose to live inside it." That hurt him. I could see it, because it took away the last clean refuge. Parents were part of it, yes, but not enough to erase his agency. He laughed once, bitterly. "You think I had a choice?" "Yes," I said. That stunned him. Maybe because no one in our family had ever spoken to him from that angle before. Not as a damaged golden child. Not as the burden of expectation. Not as the son everyone needed to be extraordinary, as a person who had repeatedly made choices. "You had choices every time you came to me and knew exactly what you were asking for," I said. "You had choices every time you took the stronger version and let the room assume it had come from you. You had choices every time you watched them build your future on something you knew you couldn't hold up alone." He stared at me, and for a second, just one, I thought he might finally say something true enough to matter. Not sorry. He still wasn't built for clean sorry, but maybe I know. Instead he said, "I thought we were a team." That sentence sat between us like something half-rotted. A team. One visible. One hidden. One praised. One used. One given the room. One made to disappear inside it. That was his idea of a team. I looked at him for a long time, then said, "That would only have been true if I had been allowed to exist inside it." He looked down. For the first time all evening, he had no answer. That was when I knew this really was the end. Not because everything had been settled, because the old language had finally stopped saving him. Before we left, Ethan looked at me one last time and asked, "So what happens to me now?" I should have answered immediately, but I didn't. because for one brief second I saw all the years at once: the bridge, the proofs, the speeches, the grant, the startup, my father's house, my mother's lies, his face in review when the room finally heard the difference between atmosphere and mechanics. Then I said the only honest thing left. You find out who you are without stolen light. He went very still after that, then gave me a look I had never seen before. Not anger, not arrogance, not panic, fear, real fear. And that was when I understood something I had missed until then. The company was not the only thing that had died. For the first time in his life, my brother had no idea what kind of man would be left when nobody mistook him for a genius anymore. The strangest part of collapse is how ordinary the next morning looks. After a confrontation, people expect thunder, a message, a final twist, a dramatic consequence arriving immediately like a movie keeping its promise. Real life is crueler than that. It lets the sun come up normally. It lets coffee brew. It lets traffic move. It lets the world continue in a way that makes private destruction feel almost embarrassing. The morning after I met Ethan by the river, I woke before my alarm. The city outside my windows was pale and gray, the buildings across from mine still half asleep, their glass catching the first thin light of day. For a few seconds, I lay there in bed listening to the silence in my apartment. And I understood, before checking my phone, that something had changed in a way that would not be reversed. Not because Ethan had apologized. He hadn't. Not really. Not in any satisfying, cinematic, morally complete way. What had changed was smaller and therefore more permanent. For the first time in his life, he had sat across from me without a role to perform. No founder, no golden child, no inevitable future of the family, no admired son standing in borrowed architecture. Just a tired man asking what would remain if nobody misread him anymore. That was new. That was terrifying. And whether he understood it or not, that terror meant the mythology had finally stopped protecting him from himself. My phone had 6 notifications. 2 from my mother, 1 from my father. Nothing from Ethan. That made sense. The conversation by the river had not ended with resolution. It had ended with exposure of a different kind. Not public this time. Private. Existential. He had spent years asking rooms to see him in a particular shape. Now even he wasn't sure that shape existed once the lighting changed. The first message from my mother was sent just after midnight. Did you meet him? The second came around 2 in the morning. Please tell me he's okay. I stared at those words for a long time. Not because I didn't understand them, because of the order. Not please tell me the house will be okay. Not please tell me Dad is calmer. Not please tell me this can still be fixed. Just please tell me he's okay. Mothers are strange that way. Even after years of choosing the lie, even after helping build the altar that swallowed the rest of us, some frightened animal part of them remains curled around the child they think is about to fall through the world. I didn't answer right away. I showered, made coffee, stood in my kitchen watching the steam rise from the mug. The city brightened in increments. And while I stood there, I realized something I had not fully allowed myself to know before. I was tired. Not the simple tiredness of bad sleep or too much work. A deeper exhaustion. The kind that comes when a role you have played for years finally ends and your body doesn't yet know what to do with the absence. I had spent so much of my life being load-bearing, quietly, invisibly, unwillingly. That part of me had started confusing my own existence with utility. Be useful, be steady, be calm, be precise. Be the person who can survive what the others cannot. And now, with the system broken, I was standing inside a silence that no longer required me to hold up anybody else's illusions. That silence should have felt triumphant. It didn't. It felt unfamiliar. That is the thing no one tells you about escaping a family role. Freedom and disorientation often arrive holding hands. I finally replied to my mother with one sentence. He's alive. The rest is not my responsibility anymore. She read it immediately. No answer came back. That was fine. Some sentences need to sit for a while before anyone can emotionally afford to touch them. 3 days later, Ethan's company effectively ceased to exist. Not legally, not all at once, not in one satisfying event. But functionally, it was over. Daniel Mercer confirmed it first. He called me near lunch, his voice low and almost respectful, the way people sound when they know they are walking through the edges of something private and expensive. "They're done," he said. I was at my desk, a spreadsheet open in front of me, numbers filling the screen in neat rows that suddenly looked almost comforting in their honesty. "What happened?" I asked. He let out a breath. "The final holdouts pulled back. Officially? No one used dramatic language, but yes, that tracked. No one with experience and money enjoys making emotional declarations about collapse. They prefer antiseptic terms. They prefer words that sound procedural enough to protect their own dignity for having been involved at all. Restructuring, withdrawal, pause, reassessment. Not viable. The company dies beneath paper language, and by the time anyone says the word dead, it has already been dead for days. Was there a reason given? I asked. Daniel almost laughed. Several. Which one was real? This time he did laugh, though not with humor. That the technical foundation is no longer considered trustworthy. I stared at the screen in front of me and felt something in my chest settle. Not joy, not revenge, recognition. Because that was the cleanest possible ending for the company. Not market conditions, not bad timing, not operational complexity. Trustworthy. Or rather, not trustworthy. Which was always the hidden issue, wasn't it? Not whether Ethan had a clever enough pitch. Not whether the company sounded scalable in the abstract. Whether the people holding the wheel actually deserved to be there. Daniel kept talking. There's more. Of course there is. He lowered his voice. One of the groups wants a formal record of the authorship issue preserved in case anything connected to prior representations resurfaces later. There it was. The afterlife of a lie. Even when the company was gone, the record needed to survive. Because once credibility has broken in the right room, people stop merely walking away. They start preparing for what the broken person might try next. That mattered. Because men like Ethan, especially when they've spent years being admired beyond their actual scale, do not surrender identity cleanly. They try on new narratives, misunderstood, overexposed, targeted, undermined. Some version of events in which the room's reaction was still the deeper crime. A preserved record is what stops those future costumes from fitting too well. Thank you for telling me, I said. Daniel was quiet a second. Then, for what it's worth, I think they understand now. I looked out the window. The sky had gone white with afternoon glare. I'm not sure that matters anymore, I said. It might to you later, he replied. Then he hung up. I sat there for a long time after that. The company was done. The structure that had justified the refinance, the panic, the posts, the meeting, the bloodless legal language, the house-sized fear finished. And still the feeling that arrived was not satisfaction. It was something closer to grief's colder cousin. Not because I wanted the company saved, because so much destruction had been required to finally make one very simple sentence true in a room full of adults. He was not what they said. That should not have cost a house. It should not have cost my mother her illusions, my father his pride, Ethan his future shape, and me years of authorship. But family systems almost always overpay for the truths they delay. I didn't hear from my father for nearly 2 weeks after the company died. That worried me more than constant messages would have. Silence from men like him usually means one of two things. Either they are regrouping and still believe control can be restored later, or they have finally hit the stage where control no longer feels like a language they can speak without humiliating themselves. I wasn't sure which one this was until my mother called on a Sunday afternoon. The line was bad. Or maybe her voice was. Sometimes distress distorts a person so fully it sounds like static even through a clear signal. "He's selling the house," she said. Not "we're selling the house." He's selling the house. That mattered, because the way she said it made it sound less like a family decision and more like the visible consequence of one man's collapse in judgment. I sat down slowly on the arm of my couch. When? As soon as possible. Of course, pressure does not wait for graceful timing. Pressure asks what can be liquidated fastest and lets everyone else cry in the next room. My mother inhaled shakily. "He says it's practical." I almost smiled. There it was. My father's final refuge, practicality. Whenever he could not emotionally survive a truth, he translated it into logistics, as if renaming a wound into a market decision made it less personal. "Is it?" I asked. There was a pause. Then, very quietly, "No." That was enough. I knew what she meant. It wasn't a choice in the meaningful sense. It was an outcome, a consequence with a realtor attached. The house would not be sold because it was wise to simplify. It would be sold because faith dressed as strategy had finally received its bill. A few days later, I drove over. I don't fully know why. Maybe because houses remember things, and I wanted to see what ours looked like when the story had finally vacated it. Maybe because I knew some part of me needed to stand inside those rooms one last time while they still contained the furniture of my childhood. Or maybe because I wanted to look at the hallway and confirm what I already suspected. The acceptance letter was gone. That was the first thing I noticed. Halfway down the corridor, above the side table where my mother used to arrange flowers, there was now just a pale rectangle on the wall where the frame had hung long enough to protect the paint behind it. That nearly undid me. Not because of the letter itself, because there was something so brutally honest about the absence. An altar had existed there, and now it didn't. My father was in the kitchen when I found him. No business section, no pressed shirt, no glass of wine. Just a man in an old blue sweater standing by the sink, looking at a stack of papers he had clearly already read too many times. He looked up when I walked in. For a second, neither of us said anything. Then he said, "The market's not terrible." I almost laughed. Because of course that was the first sentence. Not hello. Not you came. Not this is what happened. The market. Always one layer of abstraction between himself and pain. "That's good," I said. He nodded once, then looked back down at the papers. Could be worse. There it was. The old posture. Still trying to make dignity out of the measurable parts. Still trying to act as though the only relevant dimension of loss was numerical. But the thing about men like my father is that when you've lived with them long enough, you learn how to hear the fractures under the sentences. The market could be worse meant. I cannot speak directly about what I did. Could be worse meant. I need to believe there is still a version of this where I was prudent. Just unlucky. I leaned against the counter opposite him. He looked older than he had at the porch, older than after the meeting, older even than my mother had said. Not in skin, in posture. The body can hold authority for years after the soul no longer finds it believable. I should have asked different questions, he said suddenly. No preamble, no explanation, just that. The sentence landed between us with such strange softness that I did not answer immediately, because I knew what it was and what it wasn't. It wasn't an apology, not fully. My father was not a man built for moral surrender, but it was the closest thing he had. It was an acknowledgement that faith had replaced due diligence, and he had called that wisdom because he liked what it reflected back on him. I know, I said. He nodded. Then, after a long silence, he really believed he could make it real later. That hurt in a new way. Because I had spent years thinking Ethan's deepest vice was arrogance. But no, it was something more pathetic and more common. Deferred conscience. The belief that if a false thing becomes successful enough, it will eventually justify the conditions of its own making. I looked at my father. And you believed him? He shut his eyes for a second. Yes. That yes mattered. Small, late, true. Then he asked, "Do you hate him?" I thought about that carefully. The easy answer would have been no. The dramatic one, yes. The real answer lived somewhere colder. No, I said. Not anymore. He looked at me. What do you feel? I stared past him, through the kitchen window, into the backyard where Ethan and I used to run as children when everything was still small enough to be mistaken for manageable. Then I said, relief that I'm no longer carrying him. My father did not answer. Maybe because he understood that sentence more than anything else I had said. Maybe because for the first time, he could finally see the architecture, not the emotional one, the labor one, the hidden system beneath the family story that had cost all of us more than he had ever priced correctly. There is a particular sadness to watching a mother pack a house after the myth it was built to display has died. She doesn't just wrap dishes. She handles memory, meaning, evidence of who she thought she had been inside those walls. When I went back the following weekend to help, my mother was in the dining room surrounded by half-filled boxes. The good plates were already wrapped, the candle holders stacked in newspaper. The cream runner folded carefully in tissue like it still deserved protection, even if the table it used to soften had already seen too much truth. She looked up when I came in, then smiled in that tired, broken way people smile when they are trying to acknowledge kindness without having enough emotional energy left to perform gratitude. We packed for hours. Neither of us talked much at first. The silence between us was not comfortable, but it was no longer false. That mattered. At some point, while wrapping glassware, she said, I thought if the house looked right, everything inside it would eventually become right too. I stopped folding tape and looked at her. She didn't meet my eyes. She kept wrapping a serving bowl as she spoke, almost as if the bowl had made the confession for her. I really believe that. There it was. Not just the metaphor, the whole philosophy of her life. Presentation as prayer, beauty as containment, order as denial. I sat down in one of the half-empty dining chairs. That's a hard religion to lose, I said. She laughed softly. It was the first almost real laugh I had heard from her in weeks. Yes, she said. Then, a little later, I think I loved the story because I didn't know what else to love. That sentence stayed with me longer than almost anything else she ever said. Because beneath all the damage and favoritism and cowardice, there was something terribly human there. She had needed a bright center, a child who made her feel the family meant something extraordinary, a proof. People do cruel things when they confuse proof with love, especially parents, especially mothers who believe a gifted child reflects meaning back onto the whole house. I helped her carry 3 boxes to the garage. On the third trip, as we passed the hallway, I looked at the pale rectangle where the acceptance letter had hung. She followed my eyes. "I took it down myself," she said. I nodded. "Was that hard?" Her face changed, not into tears, something quieter. "Yes," she said. Then after a pause, "But leaving it there would have been worse." That was the closest she ever came to admitting what the frame had really been. Not decoration, participation, an objectified version of the lie. She went back to wrapping dishes. I stood in the hallway alone for a moment longer. Then I touched the pale wall once, lightly, and understood that some endings are not dramatic because they don't need to be. Absence can be devastating enough. For a while, he vanished. No posts, no updates, no mutual friends hearing exciting new founder language or comeback plans, just silence. And if you've known someone like Ethan long enough, you understand how violent that silence really is. For years, visibility had been oxygen to him, not fame in some cartoonish sense. Recognition. The subtle, daily feedback loop of being treated as a little more gifted, a little more inevitable, a little more architecturally important than the average man. Take that away, and men like him either mutate into bitterness or collapse into proportion. I didn't know which way he would go. Honestly, that frightened me. Not because I still thought he might hurt me directly, because identity withdrawal makes people strange. Around 4 months after the company died, I heard through a mutual contact that he had left the state. No dramatic goodbye, no announcement, just gone. Then, much later, I heard where. A logistics firm in another city. Mid-level operations. Not founder, not advisor, not visionary, not public face. Just a job. A real one. With supervisors, reporting chains, systems that did not care about his family mythology. I remember sitting at my kitchen table when I got that news and feeling something rise in me that I hadn't expected. Not triumph, relief. Because ordinary might have been the only mercy left for him. Ordinary work, ordinary evaluation, ordinary consequences. The chance, maybe for the first time in his life, to become a man at actual scale instead of a monument built on hidden labor. That thought surprised me enough that I sat with it for a long time. I did not want him restored. I did not want him celebrated. But neither, in that moment, did I want him annihilated. I wanted him proportioned. That was different. And perhaps more difficult. Destruction is easy to fantasize about when you have been erased. Proportion is harder, because it requires accepting that the person who harmed you may not need to be destroyed to stop harming you. He may only need to stop being mistaken for what he never was. It came 11 months after the review. One short email, no emotional subject line, no urgent, no please. Just my name in the header and a body so brief it startled me. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't think I understood what I was doing while I was doing it. That doesn't excuse it. I know that now." I read it once, then again, then a third time. The first sentence was what mattered most. Not asking to be forgiven. That meant he had finally learned at least one thing: that apologies are not currency, that recognition of harm does not purchase reunion, that some truths only become moral when they stop asking to be rewarded for existing. The second sentence was more complicated. I don't think I understood what I was doing while I was doing it. Was that true? Partly. Not in the way he probably meant it. He had understood enough. He had known the edges. Known where he needed me. known when the room would collapse without my intervention. What he hadn't understood, maybe, was the total moral shape of it. The way long-term entitlement erases another person so gradually that you stop experiencing your extraction as extraction at all. That I could believe. And that was in some ways uglier than conscious malice, because it meant he had lived inside the arrangement so fully that he had mistaken my disappearance for a neutral condition of his life. I closed the email. I never replied. Not because I wanted to wound him, because some sentences are complete on their own, and because I had finally learned that my role was not to complete other people's moral moments for them. Not anymore. Let him sit inside what he had said. Let the sentence belong to him. Let truth stand without asking me to hold it up, too. That was a kind of freedom I had not understood until then. Nearly a year and a half after the house was sold, my mother came to my apartment for tea. Not because something was wrong, not because the family was in crisis again, just because she had started, slowly, awkwardly, learning how to know me outside the machinery. That sentence alone feels strange to write, because it suggests repair. And what existed between us was not repair exactly. Repair is too clean. This was something humbler. Post-damage honesty, the possibility of moments that were no longer structured entirely around avoidance. We sat by the window in late afternoon light. She held the teacup in both hands and watched the traffic below for a while before speaking. Then she said, "I think I confused being proud with needing a story." I looked at her. She kept her eyes on the street. I thought if one of my children was exceptional enough, then everything difficult about our family would somehow organize itself around that and make sense. There it was. Not all of it, but enough. A mother's private religion finally translated into language that could survive outside her own chest. "That's a hard thing to admit," I said. She nodded. "It's a harder thing to realize, after it's cost so much." We sat in silence after that. Not warm silence, but honest. And maybe that was the closest thing to grace either of us was ever going to get from the ruins. I saw him one last time, almost 2 years after the collapse. He was in town for work, a real work trip. Not a pitch, not a panel, not a performance orbiting attention, just a job that had sent him somewhere. He asked if I'd meet him for coffee. I almost said no, then yes. Not because I wanted closure, because I wanted one final look at the man left behind after the lights changed. We met near the river again. Different season, cold air, gray sky. The same kind of place where people say difficult things because the movement of water gives silence something to do. He looked older. Not ruined, just reduced to real scale. And there was something almost moving about that. Not because I missed who he had been, because I had never really known that person. None of us had. But because actual scale is the first honest gift some people ever receive. He ordered coffee. So did I. For a while we talked about ordinary things, work, the city he lived in now, my job, my apartment, the weather. All the little neutral topics people use when they no longer know whether history will sit down at the table too. Eventually it did. Of course it did. He was the one who opened the door. "I think for a long time," he said, looking into his cup instead of at me, "I confused being seen with being real." The sentence hung there between us, and because it was true. Not perfectly, not completely, but truly enough, I did not rush to cut it. "That's a dangerous confusion," I said. He nodded. "I know." Then after a moment, "I think all of us made it." That was also true. Not equally. Never equally, but true. My father had made it. My mother had made it. Ethan had made it. Even I had made a version of it by staying silent so long I started mistaking survival for consent. We were not equally guilty, but we had all lived inside the same mechanism, some in worship, some in use, some in concealment, some in pain. He looked up then. For a while I didn't know who I was without it. I know, I said. That surprised him. You do? Yes. Because I had spent years not knowing who I was without carrying him. He looked at me carefully after that, then asked, Did you ever hate me? I considered the question. No, I said. I hated what happened around you, and what you allowed because it served you. He nodded slowly. That seemed to make sense to him, in a way softer language never would have. Then he asked the question I think he had really wanted to ask all along. Do you think I can become someone decent? I looked out at the river. Dark, moving, indifferent. Then back at him. Yes, I said. He blinked. The answer startled him. Not because of anything you were told you were, I added. Because you're finally at the point where being ordinary might force you to become honest. He let out a quiet breath. Not relief. Maybe something closer to grief. Then he smiled. A small one. Not the old smile. Not the practiced one. Something less certain. Less useful. More human. When we stood to leave, there was no hug. No dramatic reconciliation. No cinematic swell of family healing. Just two people who had finally stopped lying about the architecture that once connected them. He said, You were right to stop. I nodded once. Then we walked in opposite directions. And that felt right. Not because it was cold, because it was proportionate. People always think stories like this are about revenge. Sometimes they are. But revenge is usually the least interesting part. What matters is what the story reveals about structure, about what a family was willing to sacrifice in order to keep believing its favorite lie, about what gets renamed as love when what's really happening is dependency, about what gets called support when it is actually extraction, about how many years one person can disappear before everyone else starts treating her absence as natural. What did this story destroy? Not just Ethan's startup. That was almost the least important casualty. It destroyed my father's belief that admiration and judgment were the same thing. It destroyed my mother's faith in presentation as protection. It destroyed Ethan's ability to live inside a scale that did not belong to him. And it destroyed, finally, the most dangerous lie I had been taught about myself. That my greatest value was in how quietly I could carry what others could not. That was the real ending. Not the review, not the house sale, not the posts, not even the company death. The ending was that I stopped confusing invisibility with peace. Because invisibility is not peace. Invisibility is labor without authorship. It is architecture no one admits is holding up the room. It is being asked over and over to disappear so someone else can continue looking inevitable. And once you stop doing that, the people above you do not fall because you push them. They fall because you are the thing keeping the floor level. That is what my family never understood until it was too late. I did not ruin my brother by exposing him. I ruined the arrangement by refusing to keep maintaining it. And when the arrangement died, so did the mythology built on top of it. So no, I didn't destroy my brother's future. The truth is quieter than that. Much crueler, much cleaner. I just stopped carrying it for him. And once I did, everyone finally had to meet the real weight of what they had built on my silence. My father met it in paperwork and a house sale. My mother met it in bare walls and quieter rooms. My brother met it in ordinary work, where no one mistook posture for brilliance anymore. And I met it in the only form that ever mattered: my own name, my own work, my own authorship. That was the part they had been taking from me all along, not just credit, reality, the right to exist in the same room as my own labor. And once I took that back, everything else fell where it had always been heading. Not because I was cruel, not because I was jealous, not because I wanted revenge badly enough to burn my family down, because accuracy finally entered a house built on worship. And worship, when forced to answer specifics, almost never survives. I didn't expose a genius. I exposed the fact that one had never been there.